in extreme conditions. And when one part fails, it can take everything else with it. The Tiger one was powerful, but it was also complex, heavy, demanding. It required maintenance, care, and conditions that were becoming harder to maintain as the war dragged on. Fuel shortages, spare parts, overworked crews, all of it added up. The IS-2, while not perfect, was built with a different approach, simpler in some ways, focused on impact rather than precision. And in moments like this, that difference mattered. Hans Keller's experience in that final engagement reflects a larger reality. By 1945, the balance had shifted. German tanks were still dangerous, still capable, but they were no longer dominant. The Soviet forces had adapted, improved, and learned how to counter them, and sometimes all it took was a single moment. A turret that would not turn, a gun that could not align, a second lost at the wrong time. You can almost stand there in that frozen field, feeling the cold air, hearing the distant echoes of battle and understanding how quickly everything can change. One moment you're in control, the next you are reacting. And then if luck is not on your side, it is over. But what makes this moment even more powerful is what led to that mechanical failure in the first place. Because tanks do not simply stop working without a reason. In the final months of the war, German armored units were operating under constant pressure, retreating, repositioning, engaging again and again with little time for full maintenance. The Tiger I, for all its strength, required careful upkeep. Its turret system relied on a powered traverse connected to the engine along with manual backup controls. If the engine output dropped, or if debris centered the mechanism, or if internal components wore down, the turret could slow or even lock completely. You can almost imagine what had happened before this encounter. Days of movement, cold starts in freezing weather, dust and debris working their way into gears and bearings. The crew doing what they could with limited tools and limited time. Each small issue ignored because the battle demanded immediate action. Until one of those issues finally became critical. Inside the Tiger in those final seconds before the shot, the crew was not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting their own machine. And on the other side, the IS-2 represented a different kind of thinking. It was not as refined in optics or rate of fire, but it was built to deliver heavy impact with fewer moving complexities. Its gun was slower to reload, yes, but when it fired, it did not need a second chance at close range. The 122mm shell carried enormous explosive force. Even near misses could damage tracks, optics, or external equipment. Direct hits were often decisive. The Soviet crew knew this. Their training emphasized closing distance when necessary, using terrain, numbers, and timing. By 1945, they were no longer the inexperienced force of earlier years. They had learned, adapted, and improved their coordination. Back in that frozen field after the first shot, there was no immediate round. The IS-2 crew would have begun the reloading process, heavy and deliberate, but they did not need Torish. The result was already clear. Inside the Tiger, the situation had gone beyond recovery. Systems were failing. Visibility was gone. The structure that once felt like protection now felt like a trap. The crew's training told them what this meant. When a tank can no longer fight, survival depends on decisions made in seconds. Outside, the battlefield remained tense. Other units were likely nearby. Artillery could strike at any moment. Infantry could appear from tree lines. Tank battles rarely happened in isolation. They were part of a larger, constantly shifting fight. You can almost zoom out from this single moment and see the wider picture. The Oder River line was one of the last major defensive barriers before Berlin. German forces were trying to hold, delay, and disrupt the Soviet advance. Every tank, every crew, every position mattered. But the pressure was overwhelming. Soviet forces were advancing with momentum. Large numbers of tanks supported by infantry and artillery pushing forward despite losses. The IS-2 units were often used to break through the hardest points to face the heaviest German armor directly. And that is exactly what happened here. This was not just a random encounter, it was part of a larger pattern. Heavy tank against heavy tank. Old confidence meeting new reality. Hans Keller and his crew were experienced. They had survived previous battles. They understood their machine. They trusted it. But war is not static. It changes, and sometimes it changes faster than people expect. The Tiger one was still dangerous. In the right conditions, with a functioning system and proper positioning, it could still dominate. But those conditions were becoming rare. The battlefield was no longer giving it the space and time it needed. And the IS-2 was built for exactly this kind of fight. Close, direct, decisive. You can almost feel the weight of that realization. Not just for the crew in that moment, but for the entire armored force they were part of. The understanding that the balance had shifted, that the rules they had relied on were no longer enough. The frozen ground, the mist, the silence after the shot, all of it becomes part of a larger story. A story about machines, yes, but more importantly about adaptation, about how quickly advantage can disappear. Because in the end, it was not just the IS-2's gun that decided this fight. It was timing. It was reliability. It was the ability to act in the critical when the other side could not. A turret that refused to move, a hull that turned just a little too slowly, a gun that was almost on target, and a 122mm shell that arrived first. That is how battles are decided. That is how moments become outcomes. And that is why, on that cold February morning in 1945, near the Odo River, the Tiger I lost a fight it was never meant to lose. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. Malachuyen gia viet content audio kwansu, chin tri, exahoin hiemvu. Viet les utrin fanjan chiatrong noidum gots utren, sao cho, gyu isnet 100% noidum gots baugom. Tat kasolio, toigian ten ngoi sukien, vitritrin tukat sukien vidu, minchong. Loaibo timestamp, guaban septo tren, fonkash kechuyen. Nanha, tau kau trau, kau chuman, de gai kam suk chinge. Hip ju, jukach kaungan, daiksenke, taunip jok, tranhlit ke kokan, tat ka John Vijo luong 5 viet bang shooting an. Vidu, percent 10%, kam 10 kilometer, fu, hop cho ai jok. So that fan, kite okwitek, 91, 7 hawk 1, 7, na inang 7. Judai fan viet lai fai bang fan got, so ke tu fan gote ki tu. Gyui got sat hon, judai mo part bam gan fan got hon, kong ke ulan man. Kong tu ibo sung lap luan mui, kong morong fan tiking guai noi dong got. Shuat ra van ban tuan, kong janso, kong gach jiao dong. Inside the Tiger, the crew scrambled, but every movement was a struggle against their own machine. The driver, Gerriter Otto Weiss, strained to angle the hull, hoping to compensate for the turret that refused to turn. The ground, frozen and uneven, dotted with shell craters, betrayed every effort. The Tiger, over 50 tons, pivoted slowly, each inch a battle against weight and frost. Hans Keller knew the danger. He had heard the reports. IS-2's were appearing more often, their shells punching through armor once thought invincible. Crews were destroyed before they could react. Now one loomed directly ahead. The gunner forced the hand wheel again, sweat running despite the cold. The loader stood ready, a round already prepared, waiting for a command that could not come. The commander scanned through his periscope, judging distance, angle, movement. But all of that meant nothing if the gun could not bear on the target. The IS-2 moved forward through the mist, its shape becoming clear. Thick frontal armor, a large turret, the long barrel of its 122mm gun already adjusting. Its turret rotated smoothly, deliberately, calm with purpose. The balance of power had shifted. For years, German crews had been the hunters. Now, in this frozen field, the Tiger was no longer in control. The Soviet crew likely spotted the Tiger first. They recognized the silhouette immediately. The Tiger was famous, feared, known for its strengths and weaknesses. And now, one of those weaknesses was exposed. The Tiger's turret drive, while powerful, could fail under stress, damage, or wear. In prolonged combat, especially in harsh winter conditions, small issues became critical, and at this moment, critical was exactly what happened. Hans Keller made a decision. He shouted for the driver to keep turning the hull. Slowly, painfully, the Tiger pivoted, tracks grinding against the frozen earth. The gun began to shift, inch by inch, toward the threat. But the IS-2 was already ahead. Inside the Soviet tank, the crew moved with practiced precision. The 122mm gun required separate loading. Shell, then propellant, in sequence. It was slower than the Tiger's gun, but at this distance, timing mattered more than speed. The Soviet gunner adjusted aim. The commander gave final correction. The loader slammed the heavy shell into place. The breech closed with a solid final sound. A brief silence followed, the world holding its breath. Inside the Tiger, the gun was almost on target, almost ready to fire, but it was not perfect, not yet. Then the IS-2 fired first. The blast was overwhelming, a deep shockwave tearing through the cold air. The shell crossed the short distance in an instant. There was no time to react. It struck the Tiger's frontal armor with immense force. The impact was violent, not just a hit, but a crushing blow that shook the entire vehicle. The armor held for a fraction of a second, then failed. The shell penetrated, sending fragments and shock through the interior. Outcomes in battles like this were decided in moments. Who fires first, when it matters most? The Tiger lost that moment. Outside, the IS-2 remained in position. The Soviet crew did not advance recklessly. They understood the danger. Even a damaged Tiger could still fire. They watched, waiting for any sign of movement. The Tiger did not fire. Its turret remained locked. Its gun, now damaged, could not respond. The advantage had shifted completely. The stillness was almost palpable, the kind that presses into the chest. For the Soviet crew, the threat was neutralized. Another heavy German tank destroyed. Another step forward in the war, moving toward its final phase. For the Tiger's crew, it was a sudden, harsh end. Not tactics, not positioning, but a failure at the worst possible time. Mechanical reliability rarely earns dramatic attention, but in armored warfare it is everything. A tank is not just gun and armor, it is a system. Every part must work under stress, in fire, in extremes. When one part fails, it can take everything else with it. The Tiger was powerful, but also complex, heavy, demanding. It required maintenance, care, and conditions harder to maintain as the war dragged on. Fuel shortages, spare part scarcity, overworked crews, all compounded. The IS-2, while not perfect, was built differently, simpler, focused on impact rather than precision. In moments like this, that difference mattered. Hans Keller's experience in those final seconds reflects a larger reality. By 1945, the balance had shifted. German tanks remained dangerous but were no longer dominant. Soviet forces had adapted, improved, and learned to counter them. Sometimes, all it took was a single moment. A turret that refused to turn, a hull that pivoted too slowly, a gun almost on target, and a 122mm shell arriving first. This is how battles are decided. This is how moments become outcomes. On that cold February 18th morning near the Oder River, the Tiger lost a fight it was never meant to lose. Inside the Tiger, systems faltered. Smoke filled the interior. Instruments failed. Visibility vanished. The structure that once felt like protection now felt like a trap. The crew's training screamed at them, telling what this meant. When a tank can no longer fight, survival depends on split-second decisions. Outside, the battlefield remained tense. Other units were likely nearby. Artillery could strike without warning. Infantry could emerge from shattered tree lines. Tank battles were rarely isolated events. They were pieces of a larger, constantly shifting fight. From a wider perspective, the Oder River line represented one of the last major defensive barriers before Berlin. German forces struggled to hold, delay, and disrupt the Soviet advance. Every tank, every crew, every position mattered. Yet the pressure was overwhelming. Soviet forces advanced with momentum, armored formations supported by infantry and artillery pressing forward despite losses. IS-2 units were often tasked with breaking through the hardest points, confronting the heaviest German armor directly. This was exactly the kind of engagement unfolding here. Heavy tank against heavy tank, old confidence meeting new reality. Hans Keller and his crew were experienced. They had survived prior battles. They understood their machine, trusted it. But war is not static. It changes, sometimes faster than soldiers expect. The Tiger I remained dangerous. In the right conditions, with a functioning system and proper positioning, it could still dominate. But those conditions were becoming rare. The IS-2 was designed for this kind of fight, close, direct, decisive. The realization pressed down not just on the crew inside the Tiger, but on the entire armored force they were part of. The balance of power had shifted. The frozen ground, the mist, the silence after the first shot. All of it became part of a larger story. A story not just about machines, but about adaptation, about how quickly advantage can vanish. It was not only the IS-2's gun that decided the fight. Timing mattered. Reliability mattered. The ability to act when the opponent could not mattered. A turret that would not move. A hull that turned just a little too slowly. A gun almost on target. And a 122mm shell that arrived first. This is how battles were decided. This is how moments became outcomes. The Tiger I had met its match. In that frozen field near the Oder River, its loss was instantaneous, yet the result of cumulative pressure. Years of reliance on precision, distance, and controlled engagements could not counter the evolution of the battlefield. Mechanical failure at the worst possible moment, combined with the design and tactical use of the IS-2, sealed the fate of Hans Keller and his crew. Their experience, skill, and bravery were undeniable, but the world around them had shifted. Advantage had changed hands. And in armored warfare, once it does, survival is uncertain. The story of the Tiger I near the Oder River is not just a tale of a single encounter. It is a window into how machines, strategy, and human endurance intersect under extreme conditions. Tanks do not fail without reason. In the final months of the war, German armored units operated under relentless pressure, retreating, repositioning, and engaging repeatedly with minimal time for full maintenance. The Tiger I, for all its strength, demanded careful upkeep. Its turret system depended on a powered traverse linked to the engine with manual backup controls. Any drop in engine output, debris in the mechanism, or worn internal components could slow or lock the turret completely. Imagine the days leading up to that fatal moment. Continuous movement, cold starts in freezing weather, dust and debris creeping into gears and bearings. Crews doing what they could with limited tools and scant time. Small issues accumulated, ignored until one became critical. In those final seconds, the Tiger's crew was battling not just the enemy, but their own machine. Every second, every fraction of motion mattered. The IS-2, by contrast, reflected a different design philosophy. It was less refined in optics or rate of fire, but built for heavy impact with fewer moving complexities. Its 122mm shell carried enormous explosive force. At close range, it did not require perfect conditions to be lethal. Even near misses could damage tracks, optics, or external equipment. Direct hits were often decisive. The Soviet crew understood this. Their training emphasized closing distance when necessary, using terrain, numbers, and precise timing. By 1945, they were no longer the inexperienced force of earlier years. They had learned, adapted, and coordinated. On that cold February morning, after the first shot, the IS-2 crew began the deliberate reload process. Heavy and methodical, but there was no urgency. They had already won the engagement. Inside the Tiger, the crew faced chaos. Systems were failing, smoke-choked visibility, and the structure meant to shield them now trapped them. Survival depended on immediate, impossible choices. Outside, the battlefield waited. Artillery could fall without warning. Infantry might emerge from shattered woods. Yet, in the silence following the Tiger's destruction, the IS-2 remained poised, undisturbed. The fight was over in that instant, yet it reflected a larger truth. The Eastern Front was no longer the arena where German engineering could dictate the terms. Soviet forces had adapted, learned, and improved. In this encounter, a single mechanical failure at the worst possible moment had decided everything. Advantage had shifted, history had moved forward, and the Tiger I had met its match in both steel and frost.